Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Je m'appelle Fernand de Varennes. Je suis la directrice adjointe du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement sur les droits de la personne à l'Université d'Ottawa. Et il me fait grand plaisir de vous accueillir virtuellement ce matin au nom de notre centre et de nos partenaires, le Centre de recherche en droit, technologie et société. Good morning. My name is Viviana Fernandez, and I am the Assistant Director at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to this virtual event on behalf of our center and our partners, the Center for Law, Technology and Society. Pour commencer, j'aimerais rendre hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés, et nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. I will introduce our speakers and then I'll explain just briefly how the event will go. Dr. Fernand de Varennes is our first speaker. He is United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues since 2017. He is also extraordinary professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Pretoria in South Africa, adjunct professor at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and Chen Yu-tung, visiting professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Hong Kong. He is renowned as one of the world's leading experts on the international human rights of minorities. Dr. de Varennes completed his law degrees in Canada, an LLB in Moncton, an LLM from the London School of Economics in Political Science from the United Kingdom, and a doctorate in law from Maastricht in the Netherlands. His research and publication records spanned over 200 publications in more than 30 languages. In recognition of his work and achievements in the field of human rights and the protection of minorities, he has received accolades from Africa, Asia, and Europe, including the 2004 Lingua Pax Award from Spain, the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, and the Tip O'Neill's Peace Fellowship from Northern Ireland. Our second speaker is Professor Vivek Krishnamurthy, who is a faculty member at the University of Ottawa Center for Law, Technology and Society. He holds the Samuelson Glushko Professor of Law in the Faculty of Law and is also the director of the Samuelson Glushko Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, CIPIC. Dr. de Varennes will begin the presentation, followed by a period of questions and answers conducted by Professor Krishnamurthy, who will also receive a question from the audience. This event is bilingual, so please feel free to pose the question in the language of your choice. Cet événement, c'est bilingue, donc s'il vous plaît, sentez-vous à l'aise de poser vos questions en français ou en anglais. Dr. de Varennes, please.
Merci Viviana, monsieur le directeur du Centre des droits de la personne de l'Université d'Ottawa. Chers collègues, bonjour tout le monde. Bon, d'abord, je suis ravi de l'invitation du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement sur les droits de la personne et je tiens à remercier son directeur, mon ami, le professeur Packer, pour l'honneur et le privilège d'explorer avec vous le défi, le phénomène moderne du discours haineux dans les médias sociaux qui a récemment été décrit par le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Antonio Guterres, comme un tsunami de haine et de xénophobie. Et par également moi-même, dans mon rapport annuel au Conseil des droits de l'homme de l'ONU il y a un peu plus d'une semaine, comme une pandémie de l'esprit, en anglais, a pandemic of the mind. Je vais maintenant me tourner un peu vers la langue de Shakespeare pour continuer. Before I start in earnest, however, I'd like to share with you my first, I guess we could call it incident involving hate speech just a few months after I was first elected as UN Special Rapporteur in 2017. Myself and some colleagues had to deal with allegations of a call to genocide, targeting the Igbo minority in part of northern Nigeria. Now, it's quite complex, but without going into the details, there was a deadline that was set in October by which all Igbos, men, women, and children, were to leave certain region. Otherwise, they would be crushed by cockroaches, I think was the term used, and eliminated. Now, this call was really a call to genocide, and it actually circulated widely in social media and even community radios, amongst other things or forms, in a song that was unambiguous in its call for the commission of mass atrocities against this minority. We intervened. We reminded by a diplomatic note the government of Nigeria of its legal obligations to prohibit incitement to violence and discrimination, as well as in this case, other calls to violence and even genocide. Now, to this incident, I could add the conclusions in 2018 of the United Nations fact-finding mission, which indicted Facebook for playing a determining role in its platform, being used to foment division and incite offline violence in Myanmar. In other words, by spreading hate speech, they directly led to violence, atrocities, murders, rape, and what has been described by some even as an attempted genocide against the Rohingya minority. And if I had to limit myself to only one more recent example, because I could easily add many more similar cases. There was also in Sri Lanka in 2018, a number of violent incidents incited once again through social media, following a call to so-called protect the Sinhalese majority against what was portrayed as a conspiracy by members of the Muslim minority to take over the country by adding a sterilization pill to food that was being sold to Sinhalese male customers. Riots ensued, violence, in fact, which has now become endemic against members of this minority who only represent less than 10% of the population of Sri Lanka. And in case you might be tempted to dismiss this as a rather far-fetched incident in a non-Western country, may I remind you that a United States politician very recently, in fact now elected, used social media to blame fires in California on quote unquote secret Jewish space lasers, instead of admitting that the world's climate is changing. This gives you some context for the conclusions of my thematic report to the Human Rights Council, that the time has come for the United Nations to provide global leadership in response to the global challenge of massive rises in hate speech in social media, mainly targeting minorities. And in a sense which has largely been papered over, in fact, in many of our official pronouncements at the United Nations. Now, that may sound harsh, but let me explain. Atrocities and genocide do not occur in a vacuum. Hate speech creates the fertile ground for atrocities to be committed. And as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres once again warned in the release of the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, and I quote, around the world, we are seeing a disturbing groundswell of xenophobia, racism, and intolerance. Public discourse is being weaponized for political gain with incendiary rhetoric that stigmatizes and dehumanizes minorities, migrants, refugees, women, and any so-called other, end of quote. My report warns that the conditions are ripe for an increase in violence, possibly leading to atrocity crimes and even genocide, particularly directed at minorities, as history unfortunately has already shown us. Now, on the one hand, hate is not new, but what is new, linked to social media, is the scale and speed of it in more recent years. In most countries where we do have reliable data, and that's another challenge that I won't have time to explore with you right now, but where we do have reliable data, which is disaggregated, it would seem, and we can extrapolate a bit, that in the vicinity of 3/4 of hate speech in social media targets minorities, against Baha'is in certain parts of the world, against Roma, mainly in Europe, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, against Dalits in South Asia, or even against Asians in the United States. These minorities are stigmatized, sometimes even by political leaders. In the case of Asians, for example, we've seen recently political figures, well-known political figures during the pandemic, creating conditions ripe for hate by spread or using continuously derogatory terms or loaded terms such as Kung flu or Chinese virus, etc. I issued with my report a warning that we, the international community, are failing to tackle hate speech, which overwhelmingly targets minorities. And this is one of the main points I've tried to emphasize in that report. Hate speech overwhelmingly targets minorities. In this tsunami of hate and xenophobia, this pandemic of the mind, and the time has come for the United Nations to initiate a global process to regulate, I suggest in a legally binding treaty, what is a global phenomenon and challenge, with social media being able to funnel and fan the flames of hate almost instantaneously to reach millions of people every hour of every day. Now, this would provide what is clearly needed in terms of guidance, clarity, and consistently by being also a human rights-centered approach that needs to have two central pillars. First of all, to ensure the proper understanding and implementation of freedom of expression. Because as we know, unfortunately, some governments are using this crisis, this period of crisis, to crack down, given the absence of international guidance on how to respond to social media incitement. They are cracking down to repress the voices of dissent, even prosecuting, in fact, minority themselves and even human rights defenders who are trying to raise the alarm against hate speech that targets them, ironically. And second pillar would be to, whilst also calling for efforts to focus and prioritize the protection of those who appear to be overwhelmingly the main victims. And I repeat, perhaps 3/4 or so of all targets of hate speech in social media, minorities. As we do when we prioritize the protection of the most vulnerable populations, including indigenous peoples, during the vaccinations to combat the COVID pandemic, we need to have in place measures to prioritize the most vulnerable populations in combating the pandemic of hate and incitement to violence in social media. And those are minorities. I would suggest that right now, we clearly and absolutely are not doing this yet at the global level. And only on a rather weak, I guess we could say sectional basis in some countries, where there are special initiatives, even legislation to deal with anti-Semitism, for example. But when we look more globally, hate speech in social media is spreading and increasing. And obviously at the global level, and in fact, I would say in most countries, what is in place is not working, is not sufficient, because the situation is actually getting much, much worse. We are being flooded. You need only think back in the last few weeks, the massacre of Asian women in Atlanta, which in my opinion does have a minority hate dimension. Think also about the continued physical attacks against Dalits in South Asia, against Sikhs in different parts of the world, the hate spewed against Roma and Muslims in Europe and Sri Lanka and India, the vitriol against Afro-Americans, against Latinos and Latinas, against, well, overwhelmingly against minorities. And we at the United Nations, and also in many countries, I have to say, are also failing by not naming and tackling specifically this evil. If we look at the United Nations strategy, plan of action, and guidance, and this is a criticism that I've made on a number of occasions, this is a very important strategy and plan of action on combating hate speech. However, It does not refer to minorities as being the predominant targets of hate speech. Predominant, and let me repeat, overwhelmingly, these are the targets of hate speech, around more than 3/4. Actually, and to be, once again, to be very blunt, and as an independent expert, as a special rapporteur, I can allow myself to be fairly blunt. The UN report and plan of action hardly mentions minorities directly at all. And if you don't focus on those who are overwhelmingly targeted and vulnerable, those most in need of protection, perhaps more than 3/4 of all cases, how can you effectively prevent hate speech? How can you effectively deal with it directly? Not focusing on the main targets of hate speech, which is against minorities, also means ignoring that the severest forms of hate speech can lead also to the worst instances of violence, atrocities, and even genocide. It's not only quantitatively that we are dealing with much more cases of hate speech against minorities in social media, qualitatively also, the possible harm caused, it's much worse in relation to minorities. And I think this point is not fully appreciated. The hate speech faced by minorities is different from most other forms of hate speech in social media because the harm and violence it may lead is far worse. Remember, and we need to remember this as sorry as one can be about going back to the last century and the lessons not learned in a sense. The Holocaust did not start with the gas chambers. It started with hate speech against a minority. The Nazis effectively used propaganda to win the support of millions of Germans in a democracy and later a dictatorship, but this facilitated the persecution, war, and ultimately genocide of Jewish and Roma minorities. Once again, it seems ironic to have to say this, but think of what Goebbels could do today with social media. And he would have a relatively free reign right now. In the case of hate speech in social media today, it can literally lead to thousands, tens of thousands of individuals, hundreds of thousands of individuals being vilified, pointed out, lined up, and massacred because they belong to a targeted minority. So there's also another aspect that is perhaps not always sufficiently appreciated. There's a gender dimension here, that in the sense that women who belong to despised minorities, and I use the word despised here intentionally, can easily become the targets of abuse and violence. They can be otherized and objectified, especially in social media. And we've seen it with Dalit minority women, Afro-American women, also women of color or minority backgrounds in the United States and others, that they can become even greater targets for vitriol, violence, brutality, and even other forms of violence. So that's the direction we're heading now. Evil has to be named. It's hinted in my report rather, that the United Nations and other defenders of the global human rights architecture are not doing enough in relation to this scourge we're facing, in part because we are still not naming the evil we are facing. So I've been working with a number of organizations to try to do what many governments around the world are not, obtaining clear disaggregated data on who are the targets of hate speech. And some of these, such as the South Asia Collective, Avaz, and Equality Labs, have been trying to fill the gap, at least partially. I apologize for focusing so much on hate speech in social media, but as I said earlier, this has to be named, and unless we recognize the nature and scale of hate speech and that the vast majority of those targeted are minorities, then we'll not be able to devise the effective tools, the measures and approaches to face this pandemic of hate and xenophobia. I suggested the time has come for a global approach and leadership from the United Nations to regulate hate speech in social media and take up the challenge of providing the guidance and drafting more precisely the human rights legal obligations that are needed to protect freedom of expression in minorities and to avoid, as I mentioned earlier, states from threatening, in fact, human rights defenders themselves. So 2 very brief comments, since I see I have already taken a bit too much time. My report concludes that social media has to be regulated. And this is in part also because they've had a very profitable free run for a long time, but the Wild West is finished now. Social media literally profit from hate, essentially as a result of the algorithms used in their business models. And let's be blunt about what we're dealing with here. Social media platforms are amongst the most profitable private enterprises in the world today, with little or no financial liability or responsibility. Changing a little bit in some countries, but still early. This, I've suggested, needs to be addressed head on. No private business should be immune or be able to act with impunity for the harm and violence which they directly contribute to and can unleash, as we've clearly seen in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, the United States, Cameroon, and many others. So a global regulatory approach, specifically a legally binding treaty, would also tackle this anomaly of being currently not responsible for any of the harm caused by social media, contrary to what occurs for other types of media in the world. Now, of course, social media has to be encouraged and assisted to voluntarily lift up their game in content moderation. Their community standards and any oversight or appeal should clearly commit to protecting first the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, especially minorities, and systematically integrate fully human rights standards. Quite frankly, right now, they aren't doing this. So as I said at one point, what we're seeing is not new. Even almost 900 years ago, the Muslim Andalusian philosopher and jurist Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, wrote, "Ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to hate, and hate leads to violence." And what we're seeing today is a toxic and increasingly toxic environment of misinformation, disinformation, racism, intolerance, xenophobia, with hate speech online, scapegoating minorities. All of this is contributing to a global increase in violence towards minorities, including even ethnic cleansing and mass atrocities. Hate speech was not born with the pandemic, but it's clear, absolutely unambiguous now, that hate speech against minorities has been increasing dramatically, gaining ground in most, if not all parts of the world through the huge impact of social media. Je termine enfin en indiquant que nous avons peut-être été trop timides aux Nations Unies, puisqu'à l'exception de mon mandat, on ne semble pas encore reconnaître jusqu'à quel point ce sont surtout d'abord et avant tout les minorités qui sont particulièrement vulnérables et visées. Même si le contexte pour de nouveaux documents juridiques internationaux n'est peut-être pas particulièrement propice en ce moment, il y a néanmoins des indices que de nombreux gouvernements apprécieraient tout de même des indications plus précises sur comment arriver à un, appelons-le un genre d'équilibre entre la liberté d'expression et les 3 niveaux d'obligation internationale dans le domaine, celle de criminaliser d'abord les appels au génocide, celle d'interdire l'incitation à la violence et enfin d'autres mesures permissibles pour protéger les droits humains d'autrui et protéger également la société de cette maladie de l'esprit que constitue le discours haineux, mais également l'intolérance et les préjudices. Merci. Je m'arrête pour qu'on puisse avoir un peu de temps pour des échanges, des discussions et des questions. Merci.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Professor de Varennes for that incredible description of his work and for the report, which he submitted last week to the United Nations Human Rights Council. And I would encourage everyone to read the report, which is currently available in English only. It is incredibly rich and thought-provoking, and I think he's done a wonderful job of summarizing the report, but there's so much more detail and nuance in there that I would encourage you to look at it. So before I begin the discussion, I want to encourage you in the audience to please contribute questions using the question tool on Zoom to enrich the conversation that we're about to have. So Professor de Varennes, I mean, thank you very much for your report. And I think the contribution that you've made, which is incredibly important, is situating this in terms of the rights of minorities and the protection of minorities. Now, you know, your report is one in a series, I think, of reports by UN special mandate holders, notably David Kay in 2019, last year Tendai Achiome, who has spoken about, you know, the problems of algorithms and racism. So I wonder if you could just start off by telling us the minority perspective is where your report centers on. Your mandate is around the protection of minorities. So what do you think that the minority lens brings to the analysis of the problem of hate that some of the other lenses don't, such as, you know, race, racial discrimination, et cetera? What's distinctive about that concept that helps us deal with this problem?
Thank you very much. I think what my report adds, which perhaps had not been emphasized enough in the previous reports of my other colleagues, is the scale of the problem of hate speech when you consider all the categories of minorities. As you mentioned, the Special Rapporteur on Racism and Racial Discrimination focused perhaps a bit more narrowly on ethnic racial minorities, whereas my own report included also linguistic and religious minorities, which may or may not have been covered by her. And once you actually do that, once you look at all of the categories of minorities, or at least the ones that are covered under my mandate, you realize the overwhelming scale by which minorities are the targets of hate speech. I've repeated that a number of times, but I do have to emphasize this. When you're talking about more than 3/4 of the cases, and I use that as to illustrate rather than to necessarily mean that this is true for all countries. But I've seen data in the United Kingdom, for example, that if you include religious, ethnic, and linguistic minorities, and you look at the data that is available there, we're actually talking more closer to over 80% of hate speech, and I should add hate crimes in the UK, targeting minorities. And therefore, it has a quantitative difference. It actually identifies where most of our efforts should be focused on. Now, in the UN Secretary General's Plan of Action and Strategy, it was acknowledged that minorities were one group of those who are being targeted, but perhaps not sufficiently that they were the main group. And I want to insist on that dimension. And to perhaps very quickly add another criticism and perhaps highlight something that was perhaps indirectly in the comments I was making, I have attended a number of activities organized by various sections of the United Nations, if you will, dealing with hate speech where almost no one mentioned minorities. Now, how is it conceivable that we can actually craft effective measures to address hate speech if we don't even identify who are the main targets of hate speech when we discuss the problem? Because we're not actually having a sufficient, I think, focus, understanding of who usually these targets are, who are the most vulnerable. And this is a problem which I'm trying to, which I raised in my report to the UN Human Rights Council. We need to identify the problem. We need to understand the nuances of who are the most vulnerable populations. And unless we do that specifically, we may actually be missing the boat. If I can, and I know I promised that this would be short, but it's like the pandemic right now. We have an effective measure, vaccines. If you were to try to vaccinate everyone in the same way at the same time, that would not be effective because there are certain populations which are more vulnerable. These have to be the populations which you target first and most effectively to do. And we are not doing this in the case of hate speech in social media.
So let's talk about those effective measures. And one of the things you did in your report and spoke about in your presentation is the international legal regime around the regulation of hate, right? And you mentioned there's 3 parts. There's a Convention on Genocide obligation on states to take measures against incitement to genocide. Then we, at the bottom, we have the 3-part test in Article 19 on justifying measures that restrict free expression, right, subject to a 3-factor test. But then there's this middle layer that you mentioned. It's the Article 20 of the ICCPR, right? Measures that promote hate, et cetera. Now, you've called obviously for international action, but I'm wondering what you would view as effective measures that states should be taking in that middle layer, because it doesn't call necessarily for criminalization of that kind of hate, but it does call for effective measures. So what might some of those measures be that states should consider?
Thank you. It actually, it would call for the prohibition of that without criminalizing, prohibiting certain types of hate speech. One point I want to re-emphasize again is that what is necessary is perhaps to ensure the protection of freedom of expression with that. So it is, in my view, necessary by drafting an international instrument, regulatory framework, to actually try to give the context where freedom of expression cannot be impinged in efforts of a state to try to prohibit, for example, hate speech. So in other words, try to be much more specific, detailed in protecting freedom of expression as a fundamental approach. In terms of what could be done more specifically in that second area, I think what could be much more effective is to indicate certain types of postings need to be removed as quickly as possible, and that financial penalties will be attached when those kinds of posting in the social media are not. Without prejudging very much, I think the German model approach is something to look at. Once again, I think it has flaws, to be very honest. You're probably familiar with that approach but, as much as I am. But I think it is one possible tool that can be used in relation to prohibiting without necessarily criminalizing. That social media platforms would have a certain period of time to remove certain types of, certain forms of speech, so certain postings, which have been flagged as the type which should be prohibited. If I can also indicate, there's another area which I think should be regulated, is the area which would require social media platforms to actually invest much more in hiring the staff required to moderate postings. Right now, for example, it's very clear that social media platforms do not actually have that much resources in terms of moderating content in different parts of the world, particularly in local languages. How can you moderate, for example, in, let's say, Malaysia, just to give an example like that, content posted in the Malay language if you actually only have a few local staff who are fluent in the Malay language who can do that. So there would be, in my opinion, an obligation to invest sufficient resources to actually have, in different parts of the world, a significant amount of moderating capability. This might have to be imposed by legislation, and it would have to be, I think, identified as one of the possible tools in an international regulatory framework. If I can just make one more comment, and perhaps just to contextualize this, when we're talking about social media platforms, we are talking about private businesses. These are private entities. And there are private entities who are profiting hugely in their business models and their algorithms. It is unconvincing for these platforms to suggest that they do not have the means or the ability to moderate content in different parts of the world, different countries. If they're not willing to do it voluntarily, then it seems to me logical to conclude that a regulatory framework has to be in place.
So lots to build off of on that answer to my last question. One point for the audience I want to mention is that there's a very active debate in this country about adopting something similar to the German NetzDG law. And our government has signaled that it might be moving in that direction. But you mentioned content moderation, and obviously the question of content moderation of platform policies is an incredibly complex set of questions that's at the center of public debate across many countries in the world right now. Now, social media platforms deal with an enormous volume of content, and it's clear that they have not done enough in terms of investing in resources for various kinds of moderation. That being said, one of the trends is certainly towards automation, right? To try to identify more content that could be harmful and to use algorithmic systems to fight the harm. Yet one of the things your report does, which is quite interesting and I think noteworthy, is that it makes the point that those systems and any kind of content moderation system can in fact have disproportionate harms on the expression of minorities, right? And we think about, for example, the use of racially offensive words, which could be seen as hateful if it's used by someone who's not a member of the group, yet those words get reappropriated by members in the group as a symbol of affirmation of identity. So I guess the question in part is one of balance, right? You have made a powerful case in the report for the right to free expression guiding these efforts. But at the same time, there's always questions around false positives, false negatives, and where do you strike the balance? So I'm just wondering, operationally, where would you come out on those kinds of questions?
Thank you very much. I think I'll try to answer in this way. First of all, we do have some guidelines, which I should have mentioned earlier, that are in place. There's a Rapport plan of action, which actually tries to provide a series of markers, if you will, of ways to identify hate speech that should be prohibited or criminalized. I forget exactly the words that are being used. I think what has to be recognized is that there are a number of flaws here, not flaws, but areas or gaps, is probably the better term, gaps that can and should be dealt with voluntarily by social media platforms. And if they're unable or unwilling to do so, then there has to be some kind of coercive approach. For example, I've had a situation recently. I have opened a dialogue with some media platform, social media platform. And in one of these, I tried to emphasize the need to integrate voluntarily human rights standards, such as the prohibition of discrimination, the grounds of prohibition. That we can say that in international law, there's a fairly consistent number of grounds of prohibited characteristics on which discrimination must not be allowed: language, sex, religion, and so forth. I thought it was a very easy example to encourage a social media platform to incorporate, if you will, that concept of discrimination by saying, in your moderating efforts, include all of the grounds, the prohibited grounds of discrimination that are recognized widely in international law. About a week ago, I'm not going to name which media platform it is, about a week ago, I received a response, which was very, optimistic from this platform, where they simply didn't do that. I still can't understand why they felt it was better to exclude certain grounds of discrimination, which we recognize in international law, and play around with a few others. And I mention that because, once again, I think it may be necessary to approach this area in a holistic way, but with sticks and carrots. So we have to try to encourage a dynamic approach, but also we may have to use a carrot. and to impose these human rights standards. Now, and maybe I'm getting away from your point, but I noticed that in some countries, social media platforms still do not get it or don't focus enough on minorities, because we do have situations where, for example, in Myanmar, there were I can identify the media platform in relation to Facebook. It was clear that the staff which Facebook had in Myanmar to deal with hate speech targeting, for example, the Rohingya, were themselves members of the majority who had prejudices and biases against the Rohingya minority. And so we actually, we try to warn the social media platforms such as Facebook that they have to focus and prioritize the most vulnerable, the minorities, in order to be able to take effective measures. And if your moderators in the country are all members of the majority, in a country where you know that certain minorities actually are likely to suffer hate speech, your measures, your system, and the moderators in place will simply not work. So this is one of the dimensions that we need to emphasize, that we try to emphasize, that the approach has to be a local approach in terms of moderation that actually is also sensitive to who are the most likely to be vulnerable to hate speech, so that you can adopt measures that are sensitive to that and are not only taking into account the majority prejudices which actually might be in place. So I think I'll try to finish there, hoping that I touched upon the issue that you had raised.
No, absolutely. And I'm going to abuse my moderator's privilege with one more question before we get to some of the audience questions, which is that, I think we could agree that some of the larger companies, at least have some commitment to the international human rights system, and that they follow the United Nations guiding principles with varying degrees of success. But one of the really troubling things that's happened, right, I think as some mainstream companies have cracked down on hateful expression, is we've seen the emergence of alternative platforms, which really tolerate just about anything and everything. And the most extreme content has moved there. And we are also dealing with an internet that is international by definition. And often websites are beyond the reach of a particular country to regulate. So, if it's a website based in the United States, it's very hard for Canada to regulate that. So what do you see as the solution to that? Is it concerted international action, or is there a need for some kind of self-help?
I think, thank you very much. Actually, you've touched a number of points here. Let me say, this is a global problem. It's a global challenge. So you cannot simply approach it state by state, country by country. So even though currently most of the major social media platforms are based in the US, I think the environment is also changing in the US. There are hearings being held right now. I actually believe, and this should be also contained in an international regulatory framework, that the days of no liability are finished. In other words, but as you know, in my understanding in the US is essentially social media platforms are not subjected to the same regulation, for example, that major traditional media are in terms of defamation or such areas. So therefore, I think this has to be looked at again. When you can actually connect directly social media companies or private companies to harm, damage, violence being done, then they have to be open to responsibility and liability. So I think I mentioned that in relation to the alternative platforms that you mentioned. We have to, in my opinion, even though I'm getting ahead of myself, because we are going to initiate a process, by the way, under my mandate, to try to draft specific guidelines, global guidelines, focusing on minorities once again and social media as such. It seems to me that the time has come that all platforms have to be, there must be some kind of liability for all platforms to be recognized, and that states be encouraged to adopt specific legislation in that regard for liability and responsibility. And this will provide a model, by the way, for countries, perhaps even as the United States, as I believe it may be heading, if fact. I don't think it'd take that much effort. And in fact, the point you just made is a convincing one for what I'm calling for, because these alternative platforms may mean we are going to be swamped by even more vitriol and hate and incitement to violence. So we need to address that directly. And finally, you referred to the guiding principles on business and human rights, I think, which were on specifically on social media that were developed recently. I intend to work with those colleagues from that working group to focus more on minorities, because the guiding principles are excellent, but once again, they did not specifically look at where most cases of hate speech occur in social media. And therefore, I think there needs to be an adjunct to those guiding principles to address where the vulnerable populations are more effectively.
So I want to turn to a few questions from the audience. There's one specific question just regarding the definition of minorities. And are LGBTQ communities considered minorities in your view, or are they examined using a different lens?
We have to distinguish. At the United Nations, there is a special rapporteur on gender identity and sexual orientation. So the issue of LGBT community is actually dealt by a separate expert from myself. In my case, my mandate only covers national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minority. So in general terms, yes, you can talk about sexual minorities, but at the United Nations, we actually have one separate rapporteur for only national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, but we also have a special rapporteur on gender issues and sexual orientation.
So I'm going to group a few questions together here and ask you sort of a question of incentives and liabilities, right? So there's a question here around, what motivates people who spread hate on social media? And conversely, what kinds of liability are either directed at the platforms or at the people who express hate online would be effective in restraining that conduct and its real-world impacts?
Thank you. The first question is actually quite complex. I'll answer it this way. Certainly there is in recent years a growing pandemic of hate speech, probably because we are going through extremely challenging times of upheaval with environmental threats, the pandemic, of course, but also in terms of society, where people feel less secure. And unfortunately, and we've seen this in our history, by the way, unfortunately, in times of insecurity and crisis, individuals are often looking for simple solutions to complex problems. And I think partially we are seeing that phenomenon. And at the same time, we are seeing a rise of nationalism in a number of countries, but a nationalism which needs a scapegoat. And historically, once again, minorities tend to be a very convenient scapegoat to blame for all sorts of problems. And politicians are trying to gain support and votes, actually, by pointing and blaming minorities for all kinds of difficulties and challenges. And I think partially this helps to understand the explosion of hate speech that we're encountering. And it's not likely to slow down because people seem to be more frustrated and fearful than ever before. In terms of what kind of liabilities for social platforms and even for individuals, let me answer it this way. The simplest answer is that there are certain forms of hate speech which are actually incitement to genocide. That has to be criminalized. That's the easiest answer, even in the case of individuals. If you're calling for a group, whether they're the Rohingya, whether they are Muslims in Sri Lanka or Jews in other parts of the world, if you're calling for them to be eliminated, then the states have an obligation to prosecute you criminally. This obviously does not happen very often, but you would be surprised at the number of incidents which are really incitement to genocide, still there. Individuals also have to be prohibited. So there should be, at the very least, social media platforms themselves suspending, ending certain accounts where in fact you have incitement to violence as recognized in international human rights law. In the case of the platforms that do not do it, I think we need to legislate. Once again, there needs to be an international global regulatory framework which would tell states or illustrate to states how this needs to be done and framed as such. And thirdly, in terms of the liability, I use an expression, and forgive me for using this colloquial expression, but I've come to believe, and I may be wrong, but I've come to believe that you have to hit social media platforms where it hurts. And where it hurts is in their wallet, their profit. And so even without, once again, wanting to prejudge how a regulatory framework should address liability of social media platforms, I think we have to look at making it less profitable to funnel and flame hate through social media. So that's the way I would answer very quickly.
Absolutely. And so one other thought here, or sort of question for you, which is, around what's known as a problem of lawful but awful content, right? So this is content that under, let's say, international human rights law, Article 19 specifically, it is certainly harmful and hurtful and expresses, let's say, racially charged or ethnically charged sentiments, but falls below the test for restriction. So do you have any thoughts on what should be done with regard to that kind of content, which can be harmful and lead, right, to people expressing things that are in fact actionable under international human rights law? Is that something that companies should be acting against as part of their own private social responsibility?
Absolutely. And the way I would frame it, and thank you very much for that question, it allows me to actually talk about the carrots. I raised this with one social media platform and suggested that it kind of, as part of their own community standards, they should proactively have in place educational and awareness raising campaigns within their own system, their own platforms, to make sure that inclusive societies, that we encourage, that we celebrate our human diversity, and say it's great to be Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Baha'i, and whatnot, that this should be something that all media platforms systematically incorporate in their own activities. They have the resources to do that. Now, on that point, the response that I had in my first initial contacts with one platform were actually quite positive. They seemed to be quite favorable to that idea. So I don't think that would be very difficult. I think even an international regulatory framework should also refer to this. Not sure if it should be an obligation or not. As I said, we are going to be looking at this obviously in the future, but I think that's one aspect to actually have not only, if you will, a repressive regime, but we need to actually have very encouraging examples and approaches to be used to address those forms of intolerance which may not reach the threshold of needing to be criminalized or prohibited.
I always like to close on an optimistic note, and I like that note that you struck of, again, finding ways that we can, take a technology that is very powerful, that has allowed for a great deal of human connection, right, which is quite positive, and ensure that we're using it for positive rather than negative ends. And I think that's a important point that you raise, that obviously there's a lot here that requires immediate action to deal with the harms, but there's also a positive case here that we can seize. I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity to speak with you, and I wanted to turn it over to my friend and colleague, John Packer, who directs the Human Rights Resource Education Center here at the Faculty of Law, to say a few words to close us out this afternoon. John.
Well, thank you very much, Vivek, for those words. And it's a great pleasure for me to just say a few words in closing, not only how grateful we were for Professor Fernand de Varennes to join us. Professor de Varennes, I don't know if he was introduced as such, but audience may know that he is one of, I believe, 4 Canadians who are special rapporteurs. Is that correct, Fernand? No, I think it's 4 at the moment. We had a couple who finished up in the last year, 1 or 2 new ones. And I know Professor de Varennes for having been involved in this field for a number of decades, I'm sorry to say. And I would say to have been soldiers in arms fighting for minority rights in the world. And so thank you for spending some of your time on a busy period, not long after the presentation of your report to the United Nations, and I'm sure a topic which is drawing an enormous amount of attention. Let me also thank my colleagues, Professor Vivek Krishnamurthy and Professor Florian Martin-Bariteau, and also our partner, the Center for Law, Technology and Society, for coming together to produce and organize and present today's presentation by Professor de Varennes. Thanks to the audience and those who also posed questions. And last but not least, let me say a word of gratitude to my immediate colleagues, Viviana Fernandez and Caroline Fauché, for your constant contributions in support of this work. Finally, let me just add a word of my personal view in a number of situations in which I am active myself in right now. Professor de Varennes had mentioned the Rohingya situation, also the Uyghur situation right now, where we have a kind of double-edged sword, where the internet and communications have allowed the opportunity to bring to light. We were able to watch in real time, watch in a terrible sense in real time in 2017, the destruction of villages through satellite technology, for example. But we also saw the fomentation that partly generated that hate and the kind of manipulation of it online. So I think this is an old problem that has gotten kind of new reach and become now urgent. I was struck by, I think it was the longtime editor-in-chief of the Atlantic Monthly a year or so ago, who had been long time committed to freedom of speech, American, I believe it's Second Amendment right. And he actually said, because of the changes in time and reach that the internet has brought, that this needs to be rethought, even in the country that defines itself in part by this kind of unrestricted freedom. And I think that's very true everywhere. So we were privileged today to have the opportunity to hear from Dr. de Varennes, and just say again, thanks to everyone who participated.
I just want to say thank you very much to the Human Rights Center for this opportunity and pleasure to meet all of you and speak to you. And I hope also to challenge perhaps certain idées reçues, established ideas that need to actually be challenged, and the time is now to do it. I want to thank Vivek and Viviana. Muchas gracias. Obrigado. Thank you very much. Shukriya, shukran.